in effect four St Kildas over the last 180 years. A small seaside village, an enjoyable place to go for weekends or longer holidays. The kind of deterioration in the early 20th century when it became pretty grungy and gritty. And now the gentrified bohemia. During the first two periods, it was the kind of place that people could go for a pleasant time. But beginning with the Great Depression of the 1890s, a lot of the grand houses and hotels were converted into boarding houses. This opened up opportunities for camp people in a quite unexpected sort of way. Prior to the 1920s, it was normal to live at home with your family until you got married, moved out and started a family of your own. The rise of the boarding houses and then of the flats, or apartments as we might call them, really changed this a lot. It made it possible for people to move out of home. It was appealing to professional young women, and it was appealing to camp women and men in particular. In the apartments in particular, it was possible to live alone or to live with friends or one particular friend as a couple. The apartments offered privacy and they also offered affordability. They were much cheaper than trying to buy a house, but they were also more private than either home or the boarding houses. Boarding houses, for example, were run by landladies who had a vested interest, of course, in keeping them respectable in order to attract paying clientele. And this meant that they tended to keep a close eye on what their clientele were up to all the time. In the 1920s, Reg Flevel and Neil Urquhart lived in a boarding house in St Kilda. Reg was a pantryman and Neil was an electrician, so they weren't particularly well paid, but they could afford to live in a boarding house, except that their landlady became upset about the fact that two men were sharing a single bed. She called the cops and Reg ended up in jail. So when the flats or the apartments started to go up to the 1920s, they were even more attractive. They didn't have landladies. There was a lot more privacy. They weren't the kind of boxy accommodation that we might think of when we think of flats. Rather, they tended to be rather grand and tended to appeal to people with a bit of surplus money. They were often large and well decorated. Henry Lewis's apartment was described as being decorated with Persian carpets, great brass gongs, curios, pictures on the walls, a very glamorous, expensive kind of place to live in. The apartments offered a degree of privacy, much more so than the boarding houses, for example, but not absolute. Truth, for example, a notorious scandal sheet, became very interested in the ways in which the apartments were reshaping St Kilda. In 1921, Truth referred to St Kilda and its apartments as Flatland, creating a sense that there was something wrong with this, that it was undesirable. It talked about the area being infested with pests and specified these pests as curious creatures, painted and powdered effeminates. All of this may have changed a bit since then, particularly the styles, but nonetheless St Kilda remains an important part of Melbourne queer life.